Welcome to Brampton Focus, a serious topic today. You would be shocked to learn that 80% of sexual assault victims are women. 60% of the victims are under the age of 17, and 80% of the assailants accused of sexual assault are either friends, family members, or acquaintances that the victim knows. My name is Charbon. Next on Brampton Focus, we talk about sexual assault, the reporting of, what you can do, and how you need to move forward after that. Next on Brampton Focus. Welcome back to Brampton Focus. Sexual assaults are probably the most underreported interactions with police. What a shocking thing to say. About 460,000 assaults take place in Canada each year, approximately. And the way they've laid it out is if you take 1,000 assailants, approximately 33 are reported to police, 29 are recorded as a crime, 12 have charges laid, 6 are prosecuted, and 3 are convicted. That means 997 assailants walk away. Now, some would say there's always that yin and yang. One would say that there is he said, she said, but predominantly the victim is female and the aggressor is male. And it is something that you have to take into consideration that the initial reaction and interaction that takes place for a victim who's coming forward and reporting this is doubt, disbelief. They've got friends, family, law enforcement, the legal issue of it all. And we're here to talk about how to change that perspective, how to give a different perspective, and how to say maybe we should be giving more time and consideration for someone who actually brings something as horrible an interaction as that is forward. I'm joined here today by a representative from the Peel Committee Against Women Abuse, which is Ms. Paula Lamb. And beside Paula is Nicole Peach, and she's from the Ontario Coalition of Rape Crisis Centres. Ladies, thank you so much for being here today. It's important to discuss this issue. I'm going to go to you first, Paula. Your basic premise and why you are here is to bring attention to the statistics that are being revealed, but more importantly, to talk about women actually going and reporting and what happens. Is that fair?
Yes. I represent a community collaborative of over 40 organizations in Peel, from health, education, counseling, all different sectors. And we're committed to providing a community coordinated effort to ending violence against women. And so the majority of survivors or victims of sexual assault are women. And so many of the people that we support are women survivors of sexual assault. And
the part about reporting, and we've talked about incidences of reporting and how they are dealt with. It's already a pressure situation for a woman to come forward and report something like this. But there is the stigma of disbelief. This is part of what we're here to discuss, correct?
Yes, definitely. There is so much anxiety or stress over, when someone comes forward and says that I've been sexually assaulted, will they be believed? How will they be treated?
Nicole, the Ontario Coalition of Rape Crisis Centres, it says what it is. A woman has been raped. She comes to your facility. What kind of assistance do you give to this, and where do you help them in that horrible voyage of getting it out there and getting some resolution?
Right. So we're a network of 29 sexual assault centers all across Ontario, and we're often the first response. So sometimes victims of sexual violence will call us a day after a rape or a sexual assault happens, but I would say the majority of them, they're calling days, weeks, or even months later. And that's really common because these folks have hesitations about what their next steps are, what kind of support is available out there. So all these individual centers across Ontario, they're there operating crisis lines for folks who want to call in and talk about what they went through and talk through their options, and also counseling and preventative education. Another big piece that individual sexual assault centers do is around advocacy. So if, for example, you're a survivor, you were sexually assaulted last night, you choose to go to the hospital, you can call a center to have a support worker meet you there and walk you through what your options are and be there as an emotional support while you go through that process. And that includes the reporting piece too, if they choose to proceed.
Now, there's a huge, there was a huge legal fight in that aspect, because the lawyer who's defending potentially the assailant, the chain of command, the legality of how it is all done. It's so important that the victim goes through a protocol. Are you able to assist him in the proper protocol to go through from a reporting, what to do, what not to do, how to go about doing the correct thing, so that at least your factual content that's derived at the hospital by the police can stand up in court?
Well, I would say most of our centers, our role is to share with a survivor victim about what's going to happen when you report, right? So what to expect, what kind of questions you think the police are actually going to ask you, a sense about what the normal process is, what your options are in terms of getting the forensic evidence collected, because some choose to do some of these pieces for the when they're giving a formal report, and some choose not to. So part of our role is to let survivor victims know what their choices are so they can pick the route that's best for them. And some of them, in fact, they hear about the criminal justice system and what that process is like, and they're like, you know, that's not something that I'm really too interested in doing anymore.
Unfortunately, I mean, it's been too many times that we've seen that a woman's sexual history is being tried in the court when it really should be focused on what happened in that interaction. Mm-hmm. Some would also say that the man has very limited defense because he was supposedly the aggressor. She said no, and he said that she said yes. There's a huge problem there. Would you say we've advanced? I will pose this one to you, Paula. Have we advanced in the way that we're treating sexual assault victims now as they were in the past because of groups like yourself and Nicole's group?
I would say yes. I think that there's a lot more training available. There's a lot of more education and understanding about sexual assault myths. I would say there's still a lot we need to do, and there's still a lot of people who still believe sexual assault myths, like, why were you wearing that? You were asking for it when you wore something like that, or you drank that much. And so there's a lot more education we still need to do.
Some would say the culpability is a huge factor in that. I mean, if someone abuses alcohol and is left as a victim, that doesn't mean that anybody has the right to victimize that person. Where the problem stems is from the legal standpoint. I mean, our courts would say, well, you invited a problem. It's because you didn't lock your store door. You wanted to have your store robbed, if you wish, but that's not the case. Have we changed? Have the courts come around to at least start to address some of those stereotypes, as one would say?
Well, I think you ask a really good question. I would say on paper, our laws are actually really ahead of the curve. There's a lot of pieces written down in law in Canada about, you know, trying to mitigate those myths and make sure that survivor victims are not held responsible for what happened, whether they're drinking, whatever they're wearing. All those pieces were made over many changes because victims had such a hard time with the court process. But I would say too, just like Paula mentioned, being able to operationalize that in the day-to-day courtroom, that's taken a little bit extra work. And that comes down the investigation process, as well as what happens, let's say, when the Crown attorney or someone who's representing you in court helps you to tell your story in the court case. So sometimes we still see those myths surfacing.
When we come back, we're going to talk about what's called underreported. That's where someone comes forward and says that they were a victim of sexual assault. And after the police evaluate what the story is and what the circumstances are, they count it unreported, meaning that they didn't feel there was enough to justify to move forward. There is a movement now to say that unreported sexual assaults are too low and we should pay more attention to it. My name is Michael A. Charbon. You're watching Brampton Focus. We'll be back with more right after this. Back to Brampton Focus. We're joined by Paula Lamb beside me, who is from the Peel Committee Against Women Abuse, and Miss Nicole Peach from the Ontario Coalition of Rape Crisis Centres. We're talking about reporting sexual assaults. Now, before we left at the end of segment number one, I talked about unfounded, or as one would say, people who come forward to the police and say that they have experienced sexual assault and or abuse. And after the police evaluate it, they consider it unfounded, that it's not necessarily a true claim. In the region of Peel, some would say that it's almost 25%, and statistics will show as you go across Canada that certain regions are worse than others in having unfounded or unable to proceed further with any type of criminal action. I'm going to go to you, Paula. That initially, first of all, it's heartbreaking. If a woman takes the time, taking the time, I'm not giving that enough justice, has the courage to say, I am a victim, something horrible happened to me, it's embarrassing, it's all those things, and then at the end of it, they find out that it's unfounded. Obviously, there's always an incidence where that is true, that there may have been culpability on both parts, but for someone to come forward to make a statement like that, most incidents are of grave circumstance. What does an unfounded ruling state to a potential victim?
Well, as you were saying, like, it's talking about being sexually assaulted is nothing to be embarrassed about or to feel humiliation or shame or guilt over. But when someone says, I don't believe you, this didn't really happen to you, it makes someone feel like what they say doesn't matter, that they should never have come forward in the first place. They should be embarrassed by this, that they've done something wrong, and they haven't done nothing wrong.
Now, Nicole, you've been in the front lines of this. I mean, you've received calls of, you're the first responder, if one would say, in a situation where a woman gets to the point where she knows that it happened and needs to speak to someone to get some guidance. I mean, when you talk to that person who's talking to you, making an accusation and crying and so emotional, it's so evident that something happened. That must be crushing when all of a sudden at the end that, either police or law says that it's an unfounded report. It didn't happen to the degree, or you had more culpability than you're reporting that you did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's often really confusing to that victim who might have felt like what happened to them, they know it felt like such a extreme violation, that what happened wasn't correct, that they said no, how it damaged the relationships in their life. And then when they go forward and formally report it, the response seems to minimize or suggest that what happened really wasn't that big a deal, or that somebody doesn't even buy their side of the story. So it can have profound implications.
When we talk about interactions and the unfortunate circumstance of sexual assault taking place, it's said that it's in many instances acquaintances and friends and dates. It's also the use of verbal abuse, negative consequences, threats to relationships, or victim blaming, rhetoric, family pressure, using all those tactics to try and negate the fact that something did happen. There's been a great effort now from both your organizations to assist in educating police and social services to be able to recognize that sometimes the pain that's been inflicted upon this person affects their memory and affects the way that they react to things. But when the law starts to take effect, when there's a situation where someone is being accused of something and someone says that it didn't happen, all those facts and all those things matter. Do you have a list, or do you have a protocol by which you share with someone to which they should go through if anything happens to them?
Yeah, we have different educational materials that we would provide.
So share with someone. I mean, I've done a couple of shows like this before, dealing with the sexual assault, dealing with reporting, and it never fears that there's someone out there that something happened to you a long time ago, and that is something that you have always wanted to say, but you were always afraid that you were not going to be believed, or that you didn't want to bring it up. And there's always one person out there, and if we could appeal to that one person, what would be some of those things that you would tell them that they need to do before they move forward and report? What are some of the things that they should do to put together or know or document?
Well, I can start. I mean,
Yeah.
I guess we often, there's some clear things that we often tell people who are recently sexually assaulted. So, for example, if you want to maintain the forensic evidence, not to shower, or let's say to get to the hospital quickly so that you can provide, your body is the piece of evidence.
Yes.
But I would say in addition, it's really important for survivors and victims to know sometimes there isn't tons of evidence, physical evidence, and that's why unfounded rates can also be so high. So, for example, if your body is the evidence in a crime, and you report it and say, I didn't consent, what happened to me was a sexual assault, the offender could just say, well, in fact, you did consent, and then it does come down to that he said, she said. So we often tell survivor victims too, do your best to remember what happened. Sometimes people take notes, some just go with a support person and tell the story the best way that they can, but we always want them to know too. If you're if your case is unfounded or there's not enough physical evidence for it to move forward, that doesn't mean you were, say, a bad victim or a bad witness in your own case. It often means there are systemic reasons why the system didn't have the teeth to move that forward. So I think that those two things are really important for victims to hear. If you want to go forward, that's your choice. And there's lots of people who support you, and there's ways you can do that well. But to know, too, that systemically, it's very common that these cases don't move forward. And that doesn't mean it didn't happen or it wasn't important.
How would you react to a defense attorney? I mean, as I said, Nicole, you're on the front lines. I mean, you hear these telephone calls, you address these people who are calling. A defense attorney would say, oh, it's buyer's remorse. Felt guilty after it happened. It's an unfounded, yes, there were indications and everything was positive, and then when it actually came down to the nuts and bolts of it, all of a sudden you want it to stop and the freight train was already going. When you look at that type of it's not a defense, but a rebuttal, how do you calm a victim who thinks about that, and that is the point that puts hesitation in their minds as to moving forward?
Mm-hmm. And you know, Michael, these are the kinds of myths that sexual assault victims hear all the time.
Yeah.
And they hear that kind of in the public or in the news, or, you know, you often hear those, you can repeat them back because they're so commonly held,
Yeah.
and they do come up in court. And so if I was to hear that, like, you know, a victim is saying to me, this is what the defense said, and it makes me feel terrible about what happened, we would be able to name that and say, that's a common myth. And you know what, if you said no, or you indicated you didn't want to move forward with what happened, that was sexual assault. And whether or not that was captured in physical evidence makes no difference. It was still sexual assault.
Yeah.
You know, and I think victims, they hear that so often, sometimes even by well-intentioned people, that what they understand has happened wasn't really the truth, or that if it can't be proven in a court of law, it doesn't have any meaning. And we would say that's not accurate. You know, the stats really point to that there's so many cases that slip through the cracks, and they did in fact happen. And there's women and other victims out there who experienced that.
Halifax Police Department has instituted a program where they're evaluating, and one of the things is the police chief in Halifax stated that in certain approaches in the way that law enforcement deals with people who are reporting sexual assault, it's almost re-victimizing the victim. With just under a minute left in this segment, how demoralizing is that? It's like a second time. First of all, it happened, and I had the gumption to come forward and the strength to report something that was so traumatic in my life, and then I'm not believed.
I think it's important that we recognize when people are asking questions to really start by believing the survivor. And as you ask questions, you will think about the story, if it is to be believed or not, or what's happening. But when you start with believing, because other crimes, you start by believing, and then things might come out, facts that are not correct, but you start with believing.
And sometimes with sexual assault, the evidence and the trauma is not outwardly visible. And we're talking about sexual assault. When we come back with our final segment, we're going to sum up and give you some tips and some information where if you need to get in touch or you need to express something, you can. My name is Michael A. Charbon. You're watching Brampton Focus. We're talking about sexual assault. Back with our final segment right after this. Welcome back to Brampton Focus. Our final segment, we're talking about sexual assault. My guests are Miss Paula Lamb and Miss Nicole Peach. Miss Peach is from the Ontario Coalition of Rape Crisis Centres, and Paula Lamb is from the Peel Committee Against Women Abuse. How we came to arriving at this topic, Brampton Focus was in attendance at one of the Peel Regional Police Board Services meeting on another issue. And as we were there, all of a sudden, Paula comes up to the microphone and makes a presentation to the Peel Regional Police Board, and we were so engaged, and I must admit somewhat shocked at some of the statistics that Paula came forth with. Give our folks at home just a brief summation of what you were doing there in front of Peel Regional Police Board meeting and how important that is for the folks in Peel to understand.
We were speaking to the Peel Police Services Board because of the results of the investigation from the Globe and Mail, which found out that Peel Region had a 25% unfounded rate, which means about 1 in 4 survivors of sexual violence are not believed and their cases are dismissed. And so we had requested from the Peel Police to make some changes, and we had recommended greater organizational accountability, increase in training for police officers, detectives, first responders. And we had also asked for them to implement an external review process where they'd work together with different advocates for women who've experienced sexual
And I
assault.
think the chief was very positive in the way that she responded to that. Is that correct?
Yes, we work with the police often. They're part of our committee, and so it's important that we work together with them on this. And we came to do the deputation so that it would be out in the public, so that survivors would know that we're working with the police to improve the system.
So, Nicole, rape crisis centers, you're at the front line. You're the, as I said initially, you're the first responder. One could say that there are really two kinds of victims. There's a victim where something happened to them today, yesterday, or within a close proximity of time. And then there's a second victim that something happened a long time ago. Both of those people coming forward, if we were going to, I used this word before, a toolkit or something that we should do. If you are sexually assaulted, what's the first thing that a victim should do? Is there a protocol that you would suggest that a victim should do? What should they do?
Well, we always say probably the best thing you can do is find some kind of support for yourself. And there are many that would choose to call the police first, but I would say there's a high majority that never do. They disclose to a friend, a family member, somebody else close to them, maybe another healthcare provider, another social service provider.
But calling the police is really an important first step.
I wouldn't say that that's the best step for everybody. We often hear from survivors who say they're not interested in, let's say, holding the offender accountable or going to court. They're just not there. They don't want to do that right now. But for those that do, we want to make sure that that option stays open for them. So let's say you are thinking about reporting. Obviously, you can do things to maintain the forensic evidence. That information, to try and maintain that. So if you do choose to report, that all goes towards the investigation. But there's other pieces too, and you mentioned historical survivors. So somebody, let's say they might have been sexually assaulted many years ago. Those cases, certainly, if you go through the criminal justice system, there's way more barriers for those cases, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. What we often suggest to victims in those cases too is know that you have a whole range of options, right? You could go to the police and report that. Often in historical cases, there could be more than one victim to the same assailant. Maybe someone else reported something similar.
Well, there's been certain circumstances where they've publicized in the media a person who is accusing someone, and all of a sudden there's been more respondents who are coming through to validate that that happened to them as well.
That's right.
With about just under 3 minutes left, I'll give you each a point to do this. I'll go to you first, Paula. What would be the most important thing you would like to see change right now to help victims?
I'd really like to see further training for providers who come into contact with survivors of sexual violence. So whether it's police, child welfare, mental health, addictions, whatever point of entry that a survivor would contact someone, that they would receive support, they would be believed, they'd be told it's not their fault, and that they would be supported in the way that they choose to be supported. When someone's been sexually assaulted, the power and control has been taken away from them. So it's really important to give that power and control back to them and
You've got their
them.
back. That's where the thing is. You've got their back, right?
Yeah.
And how can they get in contact with you?
So they can get in contact with me.
Your organization.
With my organization, Field Committee Against Women Abuse, through our website. And we have a list of agencies that they can contact to get counseling or support from. And in particular, we also have Interim Place, which is our lead agency, which has.
Now that's huge. Interim Place is a wonderful place both for reporting, support, and support systems. Correct? And there's one in Brampton.
They have locations all over Mississauga and Brampton because they partner with different agencies.
Right.
So they have 2 women's shelters in North and South Mississauga, and then they have workers, outreach workers, transitional housing support workers that are all over Mississauga and Brampton that can provide support.
Nicole, I got about a minute left. Is there one thing that you'd like to change?
Yeah, I think one thing I'd change is I would ask, people who are working at rape crisis centers and sexual assault centers like myself, we want to work closer with police. So I think one thing we'd like to see is to work collaboratively with the police so that, when survivors have experienced it, it doesn't make it through the case, the court cases, we make sure those people have support, and also to make sure that we can try and make that system work better.
And is there one thing you would say to victims out there who either had something happen to them a long time ago? That is there a message that you would give them?
I think I would say, there are agencies that will believe you, right? So if you're hesitating to contact a friend or family member, you don't want to tell anyone you know, there's confidential spaces that we've been believing victims for over 30 years now in local communities across Ontario, and there's one in your organization, in your community.
Nicole Peach from the Ontario Coalition of the Rape Crisis Centre, thank you for everything that you do, and thank you for being on the other end of the phone for those people who need it when they call. Also, Ms. Paula Land from the Peel Committee Against Women Abuse. That's PCAWA at PCAWA.org. Thank you. And thank you for your speech, too. I think that's very important to bring the issue of sexual assault and reporting to the forefront. My name is Michael A. Charbon. You're watching Brampton Focus. We invite you to come onto our website. You can suggest a topic. You can interact. If you have a question or a comment or would like to contact these organizations, please do. Again, thanks very much for watching. Look forward to seeing you again soon.